Get on your knees, now. The officer's voice cut through the afternoon air like a command meant to be obeyed without question. And for a moment the entire plaza seemed to hold its breath as Naomi Carter stood perfectly still beneath the pale Washington sky. The soft hum of traffic fading into something distant, almost unreal, as if the world itself was watching to see what she would do next, her hands resting calmly at her sides, her posture straight, composed, not defiant but not yielding. Either a quiet kind of strength that didn't shout but refused to bend, and around her a small crowd had already begun to form, phones lifting one by one, screens glowing in the sunlight, capturing a moment none of them fully understood, a moment that would look simple on video later. A black woman standing in front of two uniformed officers, their expressions tight with authority, their tone edged with impatience. But in that space, in that exact second, it was heavier than that, layered with something older, something unspoken, the kind of tension that didn't need words to be felt. "You heard me," Officer Daniel Brooks said again, stepping closer, his hand resting near his belt, his gaze locked on her like he had already decided who she was, what she represented, what role she played in this interaction. And Naomi finally moved, not down, not yet, but just enough to turn her head slightly, meeting his eyes with a calm that didn't match the scene. "Officer, there's no reason for this," she said, her voice even, controlled, the kind of voice that didn't rise under pressure, and that alone seemed to irritate him more than anything else. As if her composure was a challenge he hadn't expected, as if her refusal to match his intensity made the situation feel out of his control. "You're resisting a lawful instruction," Brooks replied, sharper now, louder, making sure the words carried beyond just the two of them, making sure the crowd heard, making sure the narrative was clear before anyone could question it. And somewhere behind him another officer shifted, glancing at the growing line of onlookers, at the phones, at the attention, but Brooks didn't hesitate. He stepped in, closer, closing the distance, the metallic clink of something in his hand catching the light for just a second, and Naomi exhaled slowly, not out of fear, but out of something closer to disappointment. The kind that settles deep when a moment goes exactly the way you hoped it wouldn't, and still she didn't move the way he wanted, didn't drop, didn't fold, just stood there grounded, present, as if rooted to something far deeper than the pavement beneath her feet. "Last warning," he said, and the words hung there, suspended in the warm air, stretching longer than they should have, as if even time itself was waiting. And then it shifted, not violently, not dramatically, just a sudden tightening of space, a change in posture, a firm guiding motion that turned her slightly, the cold touch of metal closing around her wrist with a sound that echoed louder than it should have, louder than the traffic, louder than the murmurs, louder than the quiet gasp from somewhere in the crowd. And for a brief second, everything froze, the officers, the bystanders, even Naomi herself, not because of the action, but because of what it meant, because of what no one there realized yet, because of what was about to unfold in ways none of them could predict. And as the second cuff clicked into place, Naomi lifted her gaze forward again, not at the officers this time, but past them, steady, focused, as if already seeing the outcome long before anyone else even understood the beginning. The patrol car rolled to a slow stop in front of the station, the tires brushing softly against the curb as the engine idled for a brief moment before being shut off. And in that pause, that small pocket of stillness between motion and action, the weight of the situation seemed to settle deeper into the air, not louder, not dramatic, just heavier, like something unspoken had finally arrived. And Officer Daniel Brooks stepped out first, adjusting his uniform with a practiced motion, his expression resetting into the confident neutrality he wore inside these walls, a place where procedure defined everything and doubt rarely followed. While the second officer circled around to open the rear door, the sound of the latch clicking sharp against the quiet street, and Naomi Carter stepped out carefully, her movements controlled, her balance steady, the cuffs shifting slightly as her feet met the pavement again. And for a moment she lifted her eyes toward the building, the American flag above the entrance moving gently in the breeze, sunlight catching along its edges, a familiar symbol in an unfamiliar context. And she held that gaze just long enough to register it, not with pride, not with resentment, but with recognition, as if she understood the meaning behind it in a way few others did. "This way," Brooks said, gesturing toward the entrance, his tone firm but no longer sharp, as if the public space had demanded a performance. And now, inside the boundary of the station, things could return to routine, and Naomi nodded once, acknowledging the direction, and walked forward without hesitation, her steps measured, echoing faintly against the concrete as they moved through the glass doors into the cooler air of the lobby, where fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead, and the scent of paper, coffee, and polished floors lingered in the background. And a desk sergeant looked up briefly, his eyes scanning the scene, taking in the cuffs, the posture, the calm, and something about that combination made him pause half a second longer than usual. But he said nothing, only reached for a form, the rhythm of paperwork already beginning to take shape. "Name?" he asked, not looking up again as his pen hovered over the page, and Naomi stood there, hands still secured, shoulders relaxed, her voice clear and steady as she answered, "Naomi Carter." And the pen touched the paper, writing it down without reaction, without recognition, because to him it was just another name in a long line of names that passed through these doors every day. And Brooks moved to the side, speaking quietly to another officer, recounting the situation in brief, controlled sentences, framing the encounter in the language of procedure, each word reinforcing the version of events he had already accepted as truth. And Naomi listened, not interrupting, not correcting, just observing, the way someone does when they already know the full picture and understand that timing matters more than argument. And as the process continued, the desk sergeant slid the form slightly forward, glancing up again, this time with a hint of curiosity he did not voice, because something about her composure did not align with what he expected. And in that small moment, that subtle hesitation, Naomi shifted her weight slightly and spoke again, her tone unchanged, calm, deliberate. "I would like to make a phone call," she said, not as a request filled with urgency, but as a simple statement, a next step, as if she were following a procedure of her own. And Brooks turned his head toward her, his expression tightening just slightly, a flicker of resistance, of control, of something that did not want the situation to move beyond his understanding. "You will get your call," he replied, measured, controlled, but with an edge that suggested timing would not be hers to decide. And Naomi met his gaze for a brief second, not challenging, not yielding, simply present. And then she nodded once, accepting the delay without argument, because she was not rushing this moment. She was allowing it to unfold exactly as it needed to, knowing that what came next would not be stopped by hesitation, by paperwork, or by anyone in that room. And as the fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead and the quiet rhythm of the station continued around them, something invisible had already begun to shift, subtle, almost imperceptible, but real, like the first movement of a storm still far beyond the horizon. The pen scratched softly against the paper as the desk sergeant finished writing her name, the sound small but sharp in the quiet rhythm of the station. And Naomi Carter stood there without shifting, her hands still secured, her posture unchanged, while Officer Daniel Brooks moved a few steps away, speaking in low tones to another officer, his voice controlled but firmer now, as if he needed to reinforce the version of events not just for them, but for himself. "She was non-compliant," he said, each word deliberate, measured, fitting neatly into the structure he trusted. And the other officer nodded, not questioning, not probing, simply accepting, because that was how the system worked. Details shaped into clarity before anyone looked too closely. And behind them the desk sergeant cleared his throat slightly, glancing between the form and Naomi again, something about her stillness pressing quietly against his expectations. "Have a seat," he said, gesturing toward a metal bench along the wall, and Naomi turned without hesitation, lowering herself onto it with controlled ease, the faint scrape of metal legs against the floor echoing briefly before settling into silence. And for a moment nothing moved except the slow rhythm of the station around her, phones ringing, distant footsteps, the hum of fluorescent lights above, ordinary sounds that felt disconnected from the weight building beneath them. And Naomi rested her hands lightly in her lap, the cuffs cool against her skin, her fingers relaxed, her breathing steady, not waiting in the way most people would, not restless or anxious, but composed. As if she had already stepped beyond the moment everyone else was still trying to control, and across the room Brooks glanced over again, his eyes narrowing just slightly, because that calm was beginning to feel like resistance of a different kind, not loud, not obvious, but immovable. And he stepped closer, stopping just a few feet in front of her, his stance squared, his voice lower now, quieter, but edged with something sharper. "You could have made this easier," he said, not a question, not quite an accusation, just a statement shaped by frustration, and Naomi lifted her eyes to meet his, her expression unchanged, her voice even. "I am not making anything harder," she replied, and again the words were simple, but they carried weight, separating responsibility from assumption in a way that left no easy reply, and Brooks exhaled through his nose, looking away for a brief second, as if choosing not to engage further, because something about her responses did not give him the control he expected, and control, more than anything, was what he relied on, and he turned back toward the desk, signaling subtly to the sergeant, who hesitated for just a moment before sliding a small phone across the counter, not directly to Naomi, but closer than before, an unspoken acknowledgement that the request had not been forgotten, and the space between them shifted again, quiet but undeniable, and Naomi stood when the officer approached, her movements smooth, unhurried, the chain between the cuffs giving a soft metallic sound as she stepped forward, and for a brief second the entire room seemed to slow, not because anyone understood what was about to happen, but because something in the air had changed, something subtle but real, and the officer guiding her paused just long enough to glance at Brooks, waiting, and Brooks gave a small nod, reluctant but firm, granting the moment without fully trusting it, and Naomi reached the counter, her eyes lowering briefly to the phone, then lifting again, calm, steady, as if this was not a turning point, but simply the next step in a process she had already accepted. And as her cuffed hands shifted slightly, preparing to lift the receiver, the quiet hum of the station seemed to fade just a fraction, like the world itself was pulling back, making space for something that was about to unfold in a way none of them could stop. Naomi Carter's cuffed hands lifted the receiver slowly, the coiled cord stretching just enough to allow movement without freedom, and for a brief moment she paused, not out of hesitation, but out of precision, as if even this small action deserved intention, her fingers steady as she brought the phone to her ear, the faint dial tone humming softly, a low consistent sound that seemed to echo louder in the quiet space around her. And no one spoke, not the desk sergeant, not the officers nearby, because something about the way she held that phone shifted the atmosphere in a way no one could fully explain. And Naomi dialed the number from memory, each press of the keypad deliberate, spaced just enough to be heard, a quiet rhythm that drew attention without asking for it. And Officer Daniel Brooks stood a few feet away, arms crossed now, watching with a controlled expression, his posture firm but his eyes sharper than before, because this was the moment he had allowed but did not trust. And he expected something ordinary, a call to a lawyer, a family member, someone who would react with confusion or urgency, something predictable, something he could still contain. And Naomi waited as the line connected, her gaze forward, not searching, not distracted, just focused, and then the tone shifted, the subtle click of connection on the other end, followed by a voice, distant but clear, formal, structured, and Naomi spoke, her tone calm, precise, carrying a quiet authority that did not need to raise itself. "This is General Naomi Carter," she said, and the words did not echo loudly, they did not demand attention, but they landed, they settled into the room with a weight that was felt before it was understood, and for a fraction of a second nothing changed, no one reacted. The station continued its quiet hum, papers shifting, footsteps in the distance. But then something subtle happened. The voice on the other end paused, just briefly, long enough to register recognition, and Naomi continued, her voice unchanged. "I need immediate verification of my status and location." And the response came back lower now, sharper, the tone altered in a way that only those trained to hear it would notice, but Naomi heard it, and so did something in the air around her, a shift so slight it could have been missed, but it was there, growing, expanding, and Brooks straightened slightly where he stood, his arms uncrossing without him realizing it, his attention narrowing, because something About the call no longer felt routine, no longer felt contained, and he took a step closer, not interrupting, just listening, trying to understand what had changed, and Naomi gave a short, precise response to a question unheard by anyone else in the room. Her words minimal, efficient, as if she were speaking within a system far beyond this building. And then she lowered the phone slightly, listening again. Her expression unchanged, but her presence somehow larger now, filling the space in a way that could not be ignored. And around her the small details began to shift, the desk sergeant looking up again, this time not just curious, but alert. Another officer pausing mid-step, sensing something he could not yet name. And Brooks felt it fully now, the quiet unraveling of certainty, the realization that the moment he thought he controlled had moved beyond him, beyond procedure, beyond anything he could easily correct. And Naomi finally spoke one last time into the receiver, her voice steady, unwavering. Understood. And then she placed the phone back onto the counter with a soft, controlled motion, the sound barely audible. But the silence that followed it was not, because in that silence, something had already begun to change, something that would not be undone. And Naomi lifted her gaze again, calm, composed, waiting, not for permission, not for explanation, but for the inevitable shift that was already on its way. The silence after the receiver settled back into place did not feel empty. It felt loaded, like something unseen had just entered the room and was standing among them. And for a few seconds nothing moved, not the officers, not the desk sergeant, not even the faint shuffle of paperwork that had filled the background before, as if the entire station had instinctively paused without knowing why. And Naomi Carter remained where she stood, her hands still cuffed, her posture unchanged, her gaze steady, not searching for reactions, not demanding attention, simply present. And that presence began to press against the room in a way that could no longer be ignored. And then it came, subtle at first, a single phone ringing somewhere behind the front desk, sharp against the quiet, cutting through the stillness like a signal that something had shifted beyond this space. And the desk sergeant reached for it automatically, his expression neutral as he lifted the receiver. But that neutrality lasted only a second, because as he listened, his posture changed, his shoulders straightening slightly, his eyes flicking up, not at Naomi at first, but toward Brooks, and then back again, as if trying to reconcile two versions of reality at once. And Brooks noticed it immediately, the small change, the hesitation, the glance, and something in his chest tightened. Not panic, not yet, but awareness. The kind that arrives when control begins to slip without explanation. And the sergeant spoke quietly into the phone, his tone shifting from routine to something more careful, more measured. "Yes, sir," he said, and the word carried weight now, a formality that had not been there before. And across the room another phone rang, then another, not all at once, but close enough to feel connected, like a chain reaction moving through a system none of them could see. And officers began to look up, their conversations trailing off, their attention drawn not by noise, but by the change in tone, in rhythm, in the invisible structure that held everything together. And Brooks stepped forward, his movements slower now, more deliberate, his confidence no longer effortless but maintained, held together by habit. And he stopped near the desk, his voice lower, controlled. "What is it?" he asked, and the sergeant did not answer immediately, his eyes still on Naomi now, not with curiosity, but with recognition, the kind that arrives too late to prevent what comes next. And when he finally spoke, his voice had lost its earlier certainty, replaced by something more cautious, more aware. "They are asking about her," he said, and the words landed differently than anything that had been said before, because they did not explain, they did not clarify. They simply opened a door that could not be closed, and Brooks felt it fully then, the shift from control to consequence, the realization that whatever had just been set in motion was no longer his to manage. And behind him the second officer took a small step back, not consciously, not as a reaction to fear, but as an instinct, a recognition that the ground beneath them had changed. And Naomi remained still through it all, her breathing steady, her expression calm, as if none of this surprised her, as if she had already seen this moment long before it arrived. And in that calm there was no triumph, no satisfaction, only quiet certainty. the kind that does not need to prove itself, because it already knows. And as the phones continued to ring, as voices lowered and eyes shifted, and the room slowly adjusted to a reality it had not expected, one thing became clear without anyone needing to say it. This was no longer a routine situation. This was something else entirely, something that would reach far beyond this station, far beyond these walls, and nothing about it could be undone. The shift that had begun as a subtle tremor now moved through the station with undeniable force, not loud, not chaotic, but precise, controlled, like a system correcting itself in real time, and the desk sergeant's phone remained pressed to his ear as he nodded once, twice, his expression tightening with each passing second before he slowly lowered the receiver back into place, his movements careful now, deliberate, as if every action suddenly carried weight. And when he looked up again, his gaze did not wander. It settled directly on Naomi Carter, no longer uncertain, no longer questioning, but aware, fully aware, and across the room Officer Daniel Brooks felt that change before he understood it, the way attention shifted away from him, the way silence gathered around her instead of the situation, and he took a step forward, his voice lower than before, controlled but no longer firm in the same way. "What is going on?" he asked, and the question did not sound like authority anymore. It sounded like someone trying to regain ground that had already moved beneath him, and the sergeant hesitated, just for a moment, not out of confusion, but out of calculation, choosing his words carefully, because whatever had been confirmed on that call had altered more than just the moment. It had altered the balance in the room. "You need to uncuff her," he said quietly, and the words landed heavier than anything spoken so far, because they were not a suggestion, not a reaction, but a correction, and Brooks blinked once, the instruction registering but not immediately accepted, his posture stiffening slightly, as if holding onto the last threads of certainty. "On what basis?" he replied, the question automatic, procedural, but lacking the confidence it carried before, and the sergeant did not raise his voice, did not argue. He simply held Brooks's gaze and repeated, slower this time, "Now." And that single word carried more authority than anything Brooks had said all afternoon, and for the first time the room shifted completely, not gradually, not subtly, but definitively, the line of control redrawn in a way no one could ignore, and the second officer moved first, stepping closer with a quiet urgency, his hand already reaching toward the cuffs, because whatever doubt remained was no longer worth holding on to, and Brooks stood still for a fraction longer, the moment stretching just enough to feel the weight of it, the realization settling in piece by piece, not explosive, not dramatic, but heavy, undeniable. And then he stepped forward as well, his movements slower now, more careful, as if each action needed to be reconsidered before it was taken, and Naomi remained still as they approached, her posture unchanged, her gaze steady, not watching them, not reacting, simply present, as if she had already moved beyond this part of the moment, and the metal clicked softly as the cuffs were released, the sound small but final, echoing in the quiet space like the closing of something that could not be reopened, and Naomi lowered her hands gently, the faint imprint of the cuffs visible for only a second before her fingers relaxed, her shoulders settling naturally back into place, and no one spoke, not immediately, because the silence that followed was no longer empty. It was filled with recognition, with consequence, with the understanding that something had shifted beyond repair, and Brooks took a step back, his eyes fixed on her now, searching for something, an explanation, a reaction, anything that might restore the balance he had lost. But Naomi did not offer it. She simply stood there, calm, composed, her presence steady, and in that stillness there was no anger, no accusation, only quiet authority, the kind that does not need to announce itself because it is already understood. And as the room adjusted around her, as voices lowered and movements slowed, and every glance carried a different meaning than before, one truth settled into place without needing to be spoken. The situation had changed, completely, and there was no returning to what it had been. Naomi Carter flexed her fingers once, slowly, as if reacquainting herself with the simple freedom of movement. The faint pressure from the cuffs already fading into something distant and irrelevant, and the room remained still around her, not frozen, but suspended, like every person inside was waiting for something that no one could quite define, and she did not rush, did not speak immediately. She simply adjusted her sleeves with a calm, practiced motion, the fabric falling neatly back into place, restoring a quiet order that contrasted sharply with what had just occurred. And Officer Daniel Brooks stood a few feet away, his posture no longer anchored in certainty, his hands resting at his sides without purpose, his gaze fixed on her, as if searching for a version of this moment that made sense. But there was none, not anymore. And Naomi finally looked at him, not sharply, not with accusation, but directly, her eyes steady, clear, holding his attention without effort. And when she spoke, her voice was calm, even, carrying no raised edge. "You did not see me," she said, each word measured, not rushed, not emphasized, but impossible to ignore. And Brooks did not respond, not because he refused, but because there was nothing he could say that would shift what had already settled into place. And the weight of that realization pressed quietly into his expression, subtle but unmistakable. And Naomi held his gaze for a brief second longer before turning away, not dismissively, not abruptly, just with the natural movement of someone who had already finished the moment in her mind. And she stepped toward the exit, her pace steady, each footfall soft against the floor, echoing lightly in the quiet station. And no one stopped her, no one spoke, because there was nothing left to enforce, nothing left to question, only the aftermath of a situation that had moved beyond everyone's expectations. And as she passed the front desk, the sergeant straightened slightly, not in authority, but in acknowledgement, a small, almost imperceptible shift that spoke louder than words. And Naomi inclined her head just enough to recognize it, not as acceptance, but as closure. And then she continued forward, pushing open the glass door with a smooth motion, the late afternoon light spilling in as it opened. Warmer now, softer, carrying the distant sound of the city that had continued on without interruption. And she stepped outside, the air brushing lightly against her face, the flag above still moving in the breeze, unchanged, steady. And she paused for just a second on the steps, not to reflect, not to look back, but to breathe, a slow, controlled breath that settled everything into place. And then she moved forward, down the steps, into the open space beyond, her figure blending into the rhythm of the street, indistinguishable at a distance from anyone else passing by. And behind her, inside the station, the silence lingered longer than it should have, stretching across the room like a quiet reminder, because what had happened there would not be forgotten, not by Brooks, not by the officers who had watched it unfold, not by anyone who had felt the shift from assumption to truth. And yet Naomi did not carry that weight with her. She left it behind, not as an act of dismissal, but as a choice, because she did not need it. She did not need their realization to define her. She had never needed it. And as she disappeared into the flow of the city, the only thing that remained was the quiet, undeniable understanding that strength does not always raise its voice. Sometimes it simply stands, waits, and lets the truth arrive on its own.